Member from Olmsted, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Voting is a right of citizenship. It's the fundamental mechanism by which we, the government, receive the consent of the governed. It's an important idea. It's a critical idea. In fact, I would go further and say it's a marvel of the modern world that citizens hold the power over their governments. The vast majority of humanity has not enjoyed that right. We are living in a wonderful time. But over the past couple of centuries, our little American experiment have tried again and again to disenfranchise people. And we have learned again and again and again that this leads to injustice, that it leads to abuse, and it stands against the foundations of what we are trying to do as a nation, and I will say also as a state of Minnesota. In fact, I think most of us in here would agree it's not just a right. Voting is an obligation. It's a duty that we place to this state, to our societies, to our communities. And no matter what your race is, your area code, what your income is, that is something that you should have a right to have. A say in your country and in your community. Tonight, I've heard variations on the sentence, "Those people don't deserve to vote." I feel gross just saying that sentence, but that sentiment has been alive and well in here this evening. These people shouldn't vote. The underlying premise of that question is that we have the power to say that person votes, that person doesn't. Imagine that. That is what we are saying this legislation has the power to do. Now, we heard during one of the amendments a lot of talk of the social contract, so I want to quote another Jean-Jacques Rousseau, quote, "Those who think themselves the masters of others are indeed greater slaves than they." There's been a lot of talk feeling that we are masters of other people, that we can say when they can vote and when they cannot. I want to be clear that I support this amendment. I think Representative Fraser's done a fantastic job this evening in bringing this through committee, but I don't think it goes far enough. Representative Petersburg, I think you were right. Great point. I think all those citizens should have the right to vote. Voting is not a cudgel to punish, but it's a fundamental human right in our representative democracy. Right now in Minnesota, there are 8,152 souls incarcerated around Minnesota. Each of them have dreams, they have goals, they work, they create art, they watch TV, they have friends, they have family, they pay taxes, and they have no voice in this democracy. No voice, and in fact, potentially no group needs a voice more than prisoners. Because of the unfortunate wording of our 13th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, they are the only group that is currently able to be enslaved legally. They are not paid a living wage. According to recent studies, they can be paid anywhere between 25 cents and $2 an hour for their labor that all of us enjoy. And on top of that, I don't know if you've visited a prison complex recently, most prisoners have to pay for things like toilet paper and soap out of those lousy wages that probably most of them want to either send back to their families or save up so they can be members of society when they re-enter our society. You also might not know that prisoners are still counted in our census. So the power of their bodies is represented here, but not their voice. We might call that a modern 3/5 compromise that we are happily living with right now in this state and in this country. And I've heard tonight a lot of you are very nervous about public safety, and that's great. I have good news for you. Giving voting to those who are incarcerated actually helps public safety. People feel connected to their communities. They continue that tie. So when they get back out into society, they don't reoffend. They feel the closeness of being in society. They are not, and this is a technical term we use for this, civically deceased. They are real people that we recognize. Furthermore, granting suffrage to incarcerated individuals will not lead to any sort of rise of crime or bad laws. 2 states in our union, Maine and Vermont, have never, in the history of their state, taken away voting rights for inmates. There's not been a rise in killing. There hasn't been, I don't know. People don't commit more crimes because they're like, oh, we're going to keep our voting. They still keep the law. And on that score, tonight there's been several discussions as if the law doesn't exist. The law does exist, folks. There's penalties when you break the law. People aren't not committing theft because they're nervous about their voting rights getting taken away. There's real penalties. And we're all politicians here, so I know many of you might be thinking this is politically unfeasible. So I'm just going to throw out here, and I'm glad to send this information to whoever who wants it. A national poll was conducted by the Sentencing Project, and 56% of likely voters say that they would want to restore voting rights for persons outside of prison and inside of prison. Universal suffrage is a democratic virtue, lowercase d, democratic virtue, that Minnesota should adopt. And I do hope is coming, Representative. And I want to close with a little thought exercise here that applies to this bill, but also hopefully to a bill that will come in the future. I want us to reflect on our country's sad history of disenfranchisement and ask yourself, which, if any, do you think was a good idea? Do you think it was a good idea for the Founding Fathers to give non-land owning individuals, or to not give them the right to vote? Do you think it was a good idea for Black Americans, Indigenous peoples, other ethnic and racial minorities, and religious minorities not to be able to vote? Was that a good idea? Was it right to ask 18 and 21-year-olds to go to Vietnam, risk their life for this country, and not have a voice in its political system? Was it right to deny the vote to half of humanity, all those with a gender identity of woman cannot vote? I think all of us, these are rhetorical questions, because all of us in here would say these are embarrassing moments in our history, in this country, in this state's history. And we're glad that they have been corrected. But let us not move past the point that at all of those points in history, lawmakers, some in this very chamber, thought that all of those things were justified. They thought those people can't vote. And they thought they had justification for it. And we look back on that, and we recognize that those legislators were wrong. And it was a grievous error, as we've heard from many stories. And people had to organize and fight and bleed and die to restore those rights. So tonight,
Madam Speaker, point of order.
State your point of order.
Point of inquiry. Did the member just suggest that there are members of this body right here who support slavery?
No, Representative New Brindley, he was referring to history.
Literally said people in this chamber. And I would ask that, Madam Speaker, that on a
You
point
are
of order,
out of order. It
point
is
of
inappropriate to interrupt a person's
Madam
speech
Speaker,
because
point of
you don't
order.
like what they're saying. Representative New Brindley.
Point of order, I would encourage the body to remember to not bring personalities and motives into debate.
Representative Smith, you have the floor.
Thank you. I was considering history. It's a very good thing to consider history. And I'm almost done here, so I'm just going to say I want you guys to think about those moments in history when people were justified in wanting to take the vote from other people. They were wrong. You don't want to be wrong on this. Voting is a key part of who we are.